The Origin of Species, a lecture by Sarah Salas and Jesus Milan. Alright, and now we begin with Ernst Mayr. Mayr was a zoologist who developed a new way to define species after his observation on bird species in New Guinea. This expedition took place in 1928 and was funded by Lord Walter Rothschild, who owned the largest private collection of bird specimens in the world, and he hoped that Mayr's efforts would expand his collection. Mayr was able to bring back 26 species of the birds and 38 species of orchids upon the end of his expedition to New Guinea. All of these species were new to science and had not been observed before. One issue that Mayr did see in Charles Darwin's book, The Origin of Species, is that he never explained how one species can split up into two different species. With all the biodiversity in nature, there had to be an explanation for how all these species came to be, since nature was not discontinuous. Nature was always changing, and thus organisms always had to change as well. Alright, well, before we can determine how various species can be derived from older species, we have to first ask ourselves, what is a species? How would we define it in our own words? And would that definition be a viable definition for what a species is? That issue has been around for centuries, since a clear definition has never been formed due to researchers constantly challenging each other's definitions due to different ideals on how species come to be. Today, evolutionary scientists argue on which species concept is the best fit for defining a species, which has formed various different species concepts, all which have very viable arguments but can be challenged by other species concepts, and that leads to the struggle of figuring out which one is the correct one. Alright, well, Mayr defines species as a group of interbreeding natural populations that are reproductively isolated from other such groups. This has been known as the biological species concept. Makes it easier to understand what a species is, in a way. And according to this concept, a species is part of its own gene pool. If a species is able to reproduce with a subspecies, it's because they share a potential gene pool. A subspecies is merely a different form of the same species, but just changed due to a different pressure of natural selection due to the area that they're living in. However, with every great concept, there are issues with the biological species concept. While it puts up a good argument, the biological species concept still has various issues which allow other scientists to argue whether or not it's the best fit to define a species. Because it is difficult to determine whether or not an extinct species were able to reproduce with other extinct species, or even species that are around today. So we cannot clearly put them into specific groups because we don't know what they are able to reproduce with. Another issue that the concept goes through is asexual species, such as bacteria and species of fungi, since they either go through binary fission or another form of asexual reproduction, and they pretty much just create clones of themselves. And now, going back to the biological species concept, we have sexual barriers. Sexual barriers are barriers that prevent organisms from two different species from reproducing with one another. Sexual barriers can take various forms, such as different mating seasons, females' attractiveness to certain traits, mating calls, genitalia compatibility, and whether or not sperm and egg would fuse if sex does occur. Different mating seasons is pretty straightforward. You can pretty much imagine one species of bird that mates in the spring and then another species of bird that mates in the summer. Copulation between these two species would be impossible because even if they were to reproduce, the mating seasons are not compatible with each other. Female attractiveness to certain traits. The clearest definition for this is the peacock. The male peacock has very exuberant colors, which can lower its fitness from being able to attract predators, but it also attracts mates, so it balances itself out in the end. Mating calls. We have certain species of frogs that makes a croak at a certain frequency, which attracts mates of its own species, but does not attract mates of another species. Genitalia compatibility. That one's pretty straightforward. If the genitalia is not compatible with the genitalia of another species, sex cannot occur. And then on a smaller level, sperm and egg would not fuse if sex does occur. And if all the sexual barriers are overcome, then we have a hybrid. If sexual barriers are absent, a viable zygote forms, and the zygote will be a hybrid of the two species. Most hybrids die prematurely due to incompatibility of the two genomes. In other cases, the zygote develops and does not survive to reproductive age. If, however, the hybrid does survive to reproductive age, there's also a high possibility that it will be sterile. An example of this will be the mule. Another example is a liger. Other species that are hybrids include the killer bee, which happens when the gametes from a African bee is fused with the gametes from a European bee. Then we also have the jag lion, which is a male jaguar breeding with a female lion. Hybrids don't usually occur naturally in nature. They are mostly created due to artificial selection.
There are several possibilities for the origin of speciation. There are geographic isolation, physical isolation, reproductive isolation, and sympatric speciation. Geographic isolation separates a population of a single species into two or more populations. The distance prevents breeding between populations. This is done by the geographic changes that occur on the Earth's surface. The height increase in mountain ranges, glaciers breaking apart and drifting far away, land drying out and forming deserts, continental drift, and many more can be examples of changes in geography. As seen in the image to the right, a population of beetles have been separated. One is able to remain the same because there is no change to their environment. The other must evolve to their new habitat, thus creating a new species. Physical isolation is when a population of the same species branch out and evolve to different habitats with geographic separation. On the right is an image of 4 different Galapagos finches. Each have a beak that has adapted to a specific diet. The finches on the top with the large beaks are able to crack open seeds. The small beak finches on the bottom consume insects. Although these birds look different, scientists are able to use DNA evidence to show how long they have been separated. Reproductive isolation is when two separate species are not able to produce fit or any offspring. Mating barriers are usually created over time. There are mating discrimination between pairs, which is focused on what the individual is looking for in a partner. It could be a specific sound, color, who's the strongest. It may not even be about appearance. It could be the healthiest partner, time of the year, location to mate, and so on. Sterile hybrids is also an example of reproductive isolation. A species cannot arise if the offspring cannot produce their own offspring. Ligers are a hybrid of lion and tigers. The females can give birth to offspring, but the males are sterile. Therefore, they are not a species. The last is inviability in hybrids, which allow the offspring of hybrids to survive onto adulthood and have the chance to have their own offspring. The definition of sympatric speciation is the same place. This means that a new species has arisen from a population in which geographic change did not occur. This can be difficult to do, considering there is a high possibility of breeding with the original species. There are ways to show that two species arose from the same ancestor through sympatric speciation. And this is done by looking at areas in which geographic changes is almost impossible, such as small islands. There are two types of sympatric speciation: allopolyploid speciation and autopolyploid speciation. Allopolyploid is done when two species with different number of chromosomes meet and produce an offspring. This animal will have doubled the number of chromosomes and will be fertile. Autopolyploid is when mating of two species is not required. An individual can double their own chromosome. They must mate with someone who is also autopolyploid to produce fertile offspring.